So thank you for coming and being seated for the banking and finance panel. My name is Ryan Morfin. I'm from New York. My firm is a wealth management firm, and we sell financial products to high net worth individuals, and we have a bias towards growth economies in emerging markets. And so Azerbaijan has been a market that we've been following very closely for many years. Today I have the opportunity to introduce to you three gentlemen who have different touch points into the capital markets in Azerbaijan. And we also have an abbreviated schedule because I believe the four of us are standing between you and lunch today. So we'll get right to it and jump into the kind of overviews of the individuals and what they're up to in the capital markets. We'll ask a few Q&A, maybe open it up to one or two questions for the audience, and try to get ourselves back on schedule. So to the left here, I have Taleh Kazimov, the CEO and chairman of PASHA Bank. I've got Robert Roy, the vice president of Exlm Bank, and Brian Ruane, the executive vice president of Bank of New York, Mellon. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Taleh to give a little bit of overview of PASHA Bank and what they're up to, and a little bit of the macro economy.
Thank you very much, Ryan. It's my pleasure being here with you today, and I would like to use this opportunity to thank everyone to joining us for this business forum, particularly the people who came from Azerbaijan, very long flight. Yes, my name is Taleh Kazimov. I'm CEO for PASHA Bank, and beside being the sponsor of this event, I would like to give some information about the bank itself. We have been established 10 years ago. In June 18th, we are going to celebrate our 10 years anniversary. Since first day, we positioned ourselves as a corporate investment bank. So we're primarily servicing corporates and SMEs in Azerbaijan. And 2013, we started to implement our expansion strategy. We opened a subsidiary in Georgia. It's not the state of the United States, it's our neighbor. In 2014, we expand our operation in Turkey. So we have an investment bank in Turkey. So by doing this, we would like to cover the business relationship between three countries because we see that there is a big opportunity as these three countries are business partners in the region. In the figures, we are the largest commercial bank in Azerbaijan. We hold about 10% of the market share. In terms of the assets, in terms of the loan portfolio, we're around 6%. S&P and Fitch rated us as double B minus. It is highest rating among local commercial banks. And it's worth to say that in 2015, third quarter, when we had turbulent period in economy after devaluations, you probably heard about that. Fitch upgraded our rating to from B plus to double B minus, which is very good achievement, I think, in a very challenging period. And for us, this kind of platform is very important because being as a corporate investment bank, we would like to support businesses from Azerbaijan, of course, and we would like to be the gateway to Azerbaijan. And US is a good strategic partner for Azerbaijan. And taking into account the whole development which we're having right now and we're planning in the future, I think the relationship with US is very important in terms of the experience, know-how, and expertise which we can bring to Azerbaijan. And we would like to support this to strengthen the relationship with between United States and Azerbaijan.
Thank you. I'll pass it over to Robert.
Okay. One thing I'll make clear, I'm not going to talk a lot about oil and gas. We've heard a lot about that today. As far as some of you may not be familiar with Exlm Bank, we're the official export credit agency of the United States government. We're open in a whole host of countries around the world. And our primary role is to promote US jobs, US goods and services across the globe by providing competitive financing. And when I say competitive financing, I mean financing that competes against other ECA financings that are offered for their companies that are competing against US companies. In addition to that, in many countries, the commercial banks have limited capacity or no capacity, and that's where we come in and fill the financing gap. So there's really two parts to it. We step up and meet competing ECAs, and we also step up to fill financing gaps in countries and in markets where the risks are deemed to be too much for the commercial banks to accept. As far as our experience in Azerbaijan, we've been doing transactions in Azerbaijan for over 20 years. We have extensive expertise there. One of my colleagues, Louis Emery, is an attorney. He knows the legal system very well. And I have another colleague, Cheryl Conlin. She lives and breathes Azerbaijan and Russia and similar countries, so she's a great resource to talk to as the day goes on. They both know a lot more about Azerbaijan than I do, actually. I'm in an aircraft finance group at the bank, and that's how I have been connected to Azerbaijan. But what Exlm Bank does in Azerbaijan is much greater than that. We have no sector limits in countries. We have no country limits. We have no borrower limits. If we look at a transaction and we think the transaction is creditworthy, we'll do the deal. There's extensive due diligence that we do, and that's what separates us from commercial banks. Almost every commercial bank is going to have limits as to how much exposure they can take in a certain sector or a certain country, and we don't have that. So that gives us the opportunity to fill these financing gaps where commercial banks and the capital markets are full up on certain risks, and Exlm Bank is able to do that. We have a variety of products that we offer. We can do short-term trade credit insurance for U.S. companies exporting to buyers in Azerbaijan. It gives them some comfort that they'll be able to collect on their receivables. We do a lot of medium-term type transaction work. That medium-term, when I mention that, it's transactions that are $10 million or less, and 7 years is the maximum tenor. We see quite a bit of activity there. And then we also have long-term products. That's what I do, and that is large commercial aircraft, business jets, helicopters. And then we have another group in the bank called structured finance, and structured finance would be doing project finance transactions, pipelines, infrastructure, and so forth. So there's a whole host of different types of products that someone in Azerbaijan could avail themselves of. Do they decide that they need to seek support from Exlm Bank? As I mentioned earlier, we just don't give the money away, though. We have to come to a determination that there's a reasonable assurance we're going to get paid. But I'd say our risk appetite is a bit higher than you would see at a commercial bank. As I mentioned earlier, we try not to compete against commercial providers of financing. We don't want to displace them. We want to complement them. And then, I don't know that it's really that relevant, but I'll say it anyway. Another thing that we can't do is we can't do military. If it's a pure military product, we're not going to be able to finance it. It's prohibited in our corporate charter. Another thing that governs the terms that we are able to provide is the OECD agreement. All the OECD countries who have export credit agencies are participants to this agreement, and it basically governs the terms that any ECA can give. And that's so that one ECA can't provide terms better than the other ECA in order to try to win the product for its national champion. And then within the OECD agreement itself, there's another agreement called the Aircraft Sector Understanding, and that's even more explicit about the terms. And the Aircraft Sector Understanding is what I'm most familiar with as an aircraft financier. Just to give you a general sense of how much have we done in Azerbaijan over the past 20 years, we've estimated it's about $900 million, and it covers a whole range of products. I'll mention some of them. A lot of it's been aviation. We've done a number of aircraft for Azal, and we've also done some aircraft for Silkway. So there's an example where we can do sovereign transactions, but we also have the capacity to look at private sector deals and do private sector transactions. And then some are quasi-private sector, where we'll insert someone like the International Bank of Azerbaijan in the middle of the transaction, and they will actually fund the deal, and we'll be relying on International Bank of Azerbaijan to pay us back. So there's all kinds of different things we can do with any number of entities within Azerbaijan. And again, like Louis and Cheryl and another colleague of mine, Doug Fry, is here as well. They're very familiar with the country. They know the lay of the land, I'll say. They know the legal aspects. They know all the players. So I think Exim Bank really does have a lot of good expertise in regard to Azerbaijan. We've done, aviation, as I said. We've done a lot of we've done satellite transactions. We've done telecom. We've done construction. We've done agricultural equipment. Just the whole litany of things that are produced here in the United States. It was about this time last year. Our chairman of the bank, of Exim Bank, had an opportunity to meet with the president of Azerbaijan, President Aliyev, to hear about his strategy for the country, his long-term strategy, and it was very, very interesting. And in many respects, it's an export-related strategy. Azerbaijan wants to produce more and export more on their own. In particular, it was interesting, since so much of the discussions we've heard are about oil and gas, his vision is to diversify the economy. Oil and gas is still a big part of the economy, of course, but he wants to diversify the economy and get into some other things other than oil and gas and transform the country. One thing he mentioned was agriculture. He thinks there's a great opportunity there. And also, and some of this was touched upon earlier today, and that is that given where Azerbaijan is located, there's a great opportunity for it to be a transportation hub. Not only transportation hub, for rail, but you can also have, stuff coming across the sea, and then hitting the rail hub, and then going from the rail hub into Europe. And then, since it's near and dear to me, there's also a good opportunity for an air transportation hub. And you'll see that, well, that's kind of like what Silkway is based on. Silkway is a big cargo carrier. They've ordered a lot of Boeing 747-8 freighter aircraft, which are very large aircraft, and it can carry a lot of capacity. And they're trying to build their operation into a transportation hub. So there's those opportunities that we see. And then also IT infrastructure was something else that was mentioned in the president's long-term plan. We thought that was very interesting. And then more fundamentally, and it really struck me, is that the president wants to make a big investment in the Azerbaijan people with education and training and so forth, because that's fundamental to the whole economy, right? So we really enjoyed having an opportunity to sit down with him and hear his strategy and look for opportunities where Exim Bank can work with Azerbaijan, either with the government or the private sector or someone like the International Bank of Azerbaijan to help contribute to this plan, this long-term plan. So I think that there's a lot of things that, and we've talked about it with PASHA Bank too. PASHA's come to visit with us, and we've had a number of discussions, excuse me, about potential opportunities where we can work together and do some transactions. So I think there's a lot of things that the bank can possibly do. Air, which is my area of expertise, but there might be some real opportunities. I think there's a lot of potential for infrastructure opportunities, agricultural equipment. Yes, there's some pipelines. We actually participated in a pipeline financing, so we know that part of the world, and also maybe these big shipping logistics centers that require a lot of infrastructure and development. So I think that all of those are opportunities that Exim Bank would be willing to look at in Azerbaijan and other things as well. I think our institution is well equipped. We understand the market. We've been there for a long time. And we have the in-house expertise to pull off some pretty interesting transactions. So I see a lot of opportunity there, and I'm looking forward to working with people like PASHA Bank, but people like IBA, the Ministry of Finance, and so forth, to do some more transactions in Azerbaijan. I think it's a great opportunity, and the country is a very interesting country as it further evolves. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And about to pass it over to Brian, but I found an interesting statistic that BONI handles and facilitates about $1.6 trillion dollars per day of repo tri-parties with different banks, and I'll let Brian talk about what that means, but that's an enormous amount of capital flow, and he'll talk about why that's important for Azerbaijan.
Yeah. So BNY Mellon, it's the oldest financial institution in the US, so it's over 230 years old, and it's a global financial institution. We describe ourselves as being the investments company to the world, and from a custodial perspective, That means we service assets approximating about $30 trillion. So savings from both corporates and from nations and from banks and other financial institutions all around the world. We've had good relationships with some of the premier institutions in Azerbaijan. We've spoken at this conference in the past, and so I think we come at this region from the perspective of helping those clients to facilitate cross-border flows, working with institutions within Azerbaijan. We're not a local institution, but we are a global institution facilitating trade. Ryan mentioned the repo transaction being one of that $30 trillion custody business, one of the businesses within there. And essentially, what that business is, and that's the business that I lead, that's essentially a bank financing business. It's a global business. And that business, I would say today, is probably not at an advanced stage in Azerbaijan, but I think one of the things, in addition to good relationships with our clients in Azerbaijan and the region, is that we bring to this is something that we call thought leadership, which is investing in research that's strategic and that has a longer life around the areas that we're world class. So helping our clients with what's the best in class to finance themselves if you're a bank. And that thought leadership piece, which is fairly recent, is called the future of wholesale funding, or understanding the impact of future regulations or potential changes in regulations. And that's sort of a global look at the regulatory landscape from a practice perspective. In that instance, it is again also focused on banks. But some of our thought leadership also focuses on sovereign wealth funds. We have a piece out right now on the, it's called Mastering Flows and Managing Markets, and it's a look at the emerging role that the sovereign wealth fund community's having and playing in the global financial markets. So it's providing services for capital to get in and to get out of the region is sort of our premier source for being there, or reason for being there. The second thing is holding and servicing through custody accumulated capital that's in marketable securities and investments. And down the road, I think some of these things like thought leadership, as the economy develops and companies start to access things like the depository receipt market or the bond market, those will be areas where I think some of our expertise in other parts of the world and the thought leadership that I mentioned will really be able to help our clients there.
Thank you. Taleh, I'll give you the first question. As it relates to the macroeconomics, and I'll just kind of rattle off a few data points here. The GDP is about 50 billion. Oil is about 87% of the exports and about 40% of the GDP, but it was down last year about 3.4%. Although oil output was up 2%, the non-oil economy started to slip. The IMF believes that you guys will be coming out of this dry patch due to the devaluation, and you'll probably are forecasted to grow about 1 to 1.5% next year. From a lender's perspective on the non-oil economy, where are some of the bright spots that you guys are focusing on, given that you're doing a SME type focused lending campaign right now?
Maybe just small correction. The GDP is 35 billion.
Okay.
Yeah, for 2016, and if we just give you some short, brief figures on January progress, overall GDP is in positive trend. So for January year on year, we have 0.8% GDP growth, and the main driver of that growth is non-oil sector. 1.5% comes from non-oil GDP. Oil GDP, oil and gas GDP is decreasing slightly, 0.5%. The export itself increased by 40%, 40. Of course, the main driver, as you said, is the oil export, which is 75 to 78%. But we see the positive trend in non-oil export, which is around 50% growth. So export reached to 800 million by January figures. We have slight increase in import. It's around 4%, so our import reached $450 million. And inflation, and obviously because of the devaluation after oil price decrease, reached almost 12%. That two-thirds of that goes to food good prices, and remaining one-third goes to non-food prices. In overall, as a corporate bank, we see that after devaluation, which we faced in 2015, businesses started to suffer in two directions. First, the dependence on the import hit working capital of the businesses, of corporate and SMEs, and also long-term financing. There is a scarcity in terms of the long-term financing, so for the future development, and I think the practice of Exim Bank will be very supportive in this. As a bank, in 2015, 2016, it was very, very turbulent, and we tried to support our corporate clients in terms of providing the facilities for their working capital to support ongoing business. Now, as we see that we are starting to slightly grow in terms of the economy, we started to seek for long-term capex financing for our corporates. And as you probably know, there is a approved strategic roadmap by the government, which impose a lot of development in different industries like agriculture, transportation, ICT, light and heavy manufacturing, affordable housing, vocational education is very important. So to support all these activities, we definitely will look for capacity for long-term financing. So in general, we see that there is a progress after the 2 years very shocked, let's say, situation, and we're looking forward that by the end of this year we'll see a good result in terms of the macroeconomic growth.
Most of your loans in the banking sector are denominated in local currency, and the deposits are in local currency. So it's still, even though there is this inflation and the volatility in the FX, it's still a pretty stable banking sector, would you say?
There is an issue with the liability side of the banks. After two devaluation, dollarization level reached to 80-85% in liabilities. Loan portfolio side is 50-50, so 50 is in local currency, and remaining part is in foreign currency. So banks were suffering from the open position which they had. What we see for the last 3 months is we see positive trend in the dollarization of the liabilities. Currently, it's at the level of 75%, but we still have high level of foreign currency liability in the banks, which is also limiting banks to lend, because foreign currency loans now not very attractive in Azerbaijan after two devaluations, of course.
And this question goes to Robert. Given the strength of the U.S. dollar, and maybe focus on Azerbaijan, but maybe more on the regional perspective, how has that made lending a little more difficult to some of your particular customers in the region?
Well, on the aircraft side, I'm lucky. Even in circumstances like when I'm lending to someone like Azal or Silkway, a lot of the currencies they earn are not local currencies. They earn a lot of dollar revenue, they earn a lot of euro revenues and some others, and that's almost like a natural hedge for them. It really hasn't been an issue. And then just even more globally, with a lot of the airlines that we do business with around the world, it's the same situation. If you have a domestic airline that solely earns local currency, and there's a big devaluation, that's problematic. But many of the airlines around the world don't just serve their local market, and they do have access to a lot of other hard currencies. So it really hasn't been an issue on a macro level, and nor has it been an issue with the airlines we deal with in Azerbaijan. There was a time though when there was the devaluation. We hadn't even financed a particular aircraft that we had committed to, and the devaluation happened, And we were concerned that there might be currency controls that would make it difficult for the airline to even get its hard currencies out of the country. But that wasn't the case. So we did a little bit of research and got ourselves comfortable, and all of our transactions for aircraft in Azerbaijan have performed very well. And I don't think that the devaluation has really caused difficulty for the customers that we have financed, but that's unique. If you look at, again, I can really only talk from the aircraft perspective because that's my area of expertise. In certain countries where we do have airlines that only earn revenue in a particular currency, we can do local currency financings. We've done it in a number of cases, and it's been a lifesaver for some of the airlines. There's an airline in South Africa, just comes to mind. All the loans that we have done for them are in South African rand. They only earn South African rand, and if they had dollar obligations at a time where the South African rand has, I'll use a tough term, but the South African rand has tanked against the US dollar, they probably would not have been able to service those US dollar obligations. But since those obligations are rand obligations, they're not having any difficulty at all servicing it. So we will do foreign currency denominated loans, in particular when you have companies that are really exposed to their own local currency. It's a process, though, to do these loans in foreign currencies. There's a lot of research that goes on. We have a whole team of economists at the bank that study the currency. Some currencies are pre-approved that we can do just about any size transaction in that currency. Other currencies, which I'll call tier 2 currencies, we actually have to look at each currency on a transaction by transaction basis and get ourselves comfortable that we should be doing a deal denominated in that currency. And I think the big concern from Exim Bank's perspective is that the market for the currency is deep enough. Should there be a claim on Exim Bank to pay out in that currency, that we can go into the marketplace and get the funds without causing a huge spike in the exchange rate or a huge depreciation in the exchange rate. So that's the focus of the economic research that we do. But we've done deals in some fairly exotic currencies because the markets are deep enough to withstand Exim Bank having to go into the market, get the funds to pay out under its guarantee. So there's a number of mechanisms that we use at the bank to address. It's a long answer, I know, but to address foreign currency risk that we see in some of our deals. Some it's less prevalent than others where you have hard currency earners. But for the local currency transactions, yeah, we can definitely take a look at doing transactions denominated in those currencies.
And
Yeah, if I may to add, if we're looking to development of the country in short term, currently we are more focused on stabilizing the situation after oil price decrease and to devaluations. But in the long term, and there are clear strategic initiatives which are going to be taken. And even if currently foreign currency funding is not very attractive for the businesses because people are still afraid about the further devaluation. But after stabilizing the situation, I think, and taking into account the all development plans of the country, I think there is a huge opportunity for US businesses to expand their operations in Azerbaijan, bringing their expertise, as I said before, in the industries, which is covered by a strategic roadmap, which I mentioned before. And if we take into account the Exim Bank financing opportunities, it's 5 to 10 years. So foreign currency can be very attractive even for the local Azerbaijan business, which receivables are in a manner. It will be attractive after we will stabilize the situation with the currency.
Well, and to your point, from an investor's perspective, you don't want to be going and entering your basis on the boom days. You're looking at a situation like this where it could be an attractive entry point from deploying capital into an economy that has good long-term fundamentals as Azerbaijan. Robert, going back to your comment though, how does Exim Bank look at cost of capital, and as it relates to when you're pricing out loans in terms of a coupon relative to the local lending market, do you have a target rate back in the US, or do you try to stay competitive without undercutting the corporate lending market back in the regional country of operations?
I touched upon this earlier. Actually, the pricing on our deals is pretty much prescribed by the OECD sector understanding that I mentioned earlier, and it's based on a whole host of factors. There's actually, I take a look at the transaction. I determine like how risky the transaction is on an unsecured basis. I take a look at the term. I take a look at like what things I might need to do to structure the transaction to get myself comfortable with it. And then all of those aspects feed into the model that the OECD has provided us. And basically we put all these inputs into the model and it says, this is the fee, the premium that you're going to charge for that transaction. So that's part of the pricing. So that's the amount that I'm going to be paid to compensate the bank for the risk that it's taking in the transaction. So then we say to the commercial bank that's going to fund the deal, here's a full faith and credit Exim Bank guarantee. We expect that the transaction will be priced very close to U.S. government risk. Maybe 10, 15 basis points above treasuries, that's it. So the actual pricing of the loan is quite, I could say quite nice in comparison to what these borrowers could do on their own. But then if you build in the fee that we charge, risk-based pricing, the all-in cost is probably, maybe a little bit more expensive than a investment grade credit could do on its own. But as you go further down the scale, where there's very little commercial financing available, it can be very attractive to like double B, and single B rated type borrowers. So the pricing, especially these days, we're seeing that the pricing is still quite attractive to, as I said, the mid to lower grade rated companies, and those are our ratings. We use the same scale as S&P, but those are our ratings. And then for the higher rated, the triple B minus and above, the investment grade type entities, today they can go out into the capital markets, or they can go into the bank markets and attract financing that's actually better than what we can do on an all-in basis. But things change. The markets have been very liquid over the past, 5, 6, 7 years now. There's a lot of new money coming in. The Chinese banks are lending a lot of money. You see Korean banks and institutional investors getting into the game. And the liquidity that's out there right now is quite flush. So we're seeing less of a demand for ECA financings in general because of this liquidity that's running through the market. But that's not going to last forever. There's always some event, some exogenous event that will cause these sources of funding to withdraw. I mean, they'll be there, but they'll be there in a more limited way, and that's when ECAs like Exim Bank have to step up. The perfect example was, we'll call it the Great Recession starts in 2009. Exim Bank, on the aircraft side, maybe did on an average year, $5 billion a year in financings. Then 2009 comes and it ramps up to like 8, and then 2010 comes and we're doing 10, or 2012 we're doing $11 billion in financings for commercial aircraft. And then the rest of the bank also saw a similar increase in demand because the commercial markets just were not there. And then when the commercial markets came back, you can see Exim Bank support just start to come down to more of a normal level that we are accustomed to. So, during times like this, we still serve that more risky segment with very competitive financing. Or sometimes we're the only game in town. There is no financing available for some of these borrowers, given the risk of the country, or the risk of the transaction, or the risk of their credit. And then in other circumstances, a lot of entities want to tap into Exim Bank support because they're getting support from other ECAs, so we have to compete against those other ECAs. That's the whole level the playing field concept. So there's a whole number of things that can drive the pricing. But talking about today, for the better credits, they can do better commercially. For the more risky credits, I think that Exim Bank is still quite viable for them.
Thank you. Brian, from a macro perspective, there's been some turbulence in the region, geopolitical risk. How has that changed the capital flows in the region? Are people going towards more dollar assets, or are they chasing yield and looking at more local currency-based assets?
Generally, I guess one of for this particular part of the world, the main thing that's changed is really the price of oil. And for a number of years, US dollar denominated assets have been attractive in terms of flows coming. So I don't think there's anything that's happening specifically right now related to that change. But I do think as a firm like BNY Mellon, in addition to providing the services around all forms of investment product, so the investment life cycle, and then in thought leadership, being able to provide guidance, or at least our knowledge around what professional infrastructure like clearing and collateral might be. The other element of what we bring to the region is our role as one of the largest asset managers in the world. We're about the 8th largest manager of institutional capital, and in that, we can bring an expertise partnering with local institutions around both managing their own accumulated capital, but handling things like this, whether it be dollar hedging or the move out of liquid assets into some more real assets that isn't really just particular to Azerbaijan. It's something that's happening around the world. I wouldn't really have anything to add other than it's really not different in Azerbaijan to other parts of the world. The attractiveness of the dollar has definitely been something the last couple of years. And clearly the impact of oil price is probably the main thing that's driving the amount of capital there is to invest, and also how it's invested.
With that, I'll open up to some Q&A from the crowd, and we'll ask maybe we have a question right here.
Ruane from Village. My question is for Robert and Brian. So, from the perspective of USACC, when making a decision to finance a project for the bank, what sort of risks you try to calculate? Political, economic crisis, military escalation of North Carolina.
Maybe I'll start off. So the primary area where BNY Mellon provides financing is in the settlement of really capital markets or securities or investment transactions. I'd say the reason for being there is it's part of an investment for the future in terms of building relationships. And I'd say the primary risks are really the risks around understanding the sovereign and political risks. And then I would say the other area, again, these are not only related to Azerbaijan, but the area would be understanding and even contributing and investing in an understanding of compliance and some of the risks associated with particularly the movement of money. Those risks are not particular to one area, but I would say understanding the risks in the area, and then the whole concept of making sure that we're all on the same page with regard to know your customer, anti-money laundering. And it's part of a longer term process that I'm sure over time is going to yield from the good relationships that we and others have developed, going to yield results.
We have, well, let's put it into two different segments. The first segment, sovereign deals. So if we're doing a sovereign deal, we have a whole team of economists at the bank, and they basically study the economies of the world. And they look at very macro issues, ease of doing business in the country, the legal situation in the country, the general corporate governance structures within the country, the economic condition of the country, GDP growth and that sort of thing, balance of trade payments and all those sorts of things that economists study. And they ultimately decide whether we're open for business in the country. They decide whether we're open for business in the country on a short, medium, or long-term basis. And if they tell me it's a good deal to do, we'll do it. So we rely on the economists a lot for our guidance on sovereign deals. If it's a purely private sector transaction, we take all this information that the economists have gathered on the country in general and keep that in the back of our minds, but we're very focused closely on the borrower. We'll look at all their financial statements for the past 3 years. We'll analyze those. We'll look at all the various aspects of their business and their operations and how they conduct their operations. We'll look at the management and the strategy of the management and whether we think that makes sense. We'll do all your know your customer type of compliance requests. Oftentimes, if it's a customer that we've never done business before, we would actually go and visit the customer. Like we went over to Baku a couple of times. We kicked the tires at Silkway just to check out the airline, meet the management personally, all sorts of things. So it's quite a detailed process we go through, and then once we get ourselves comfortable with the transaction, we write it up in a big presentation for our board of directors and ask them to approve the deal. So I think that the due diligence level on the private sector credits are ask anyone who's been through it with Exlm Bank, are quite exact, quite detailed. We apply a lot of scrutiny, and that's what gives us the credibility. Like when we take transactions to the board, that's what our board of directors, that's what gives us a lot of credibility, because they know how much time we spend on these transactions, time that maybe a commercial bank would not be willing to spend on a transaction to get comfortable. I think as an agency, that's what we pride ourselves on, having a lot of unique expertise in countries such as Azerbaijan, and countries in that region, a lot of legal expertise, a lot of economic expertise, and a lot of deal structuring expertise, and that's how we go about it. It's also I'd say it's just from a person that does these sorts of transactions. I also think it's quite rewarding because you really do get an in-depth understanding of your customer, and over time. And we don't typically look at these as one-shot transactions. We look at this as an opportunity to build a long-term relation. So we do transactions, and that first one's a very important one, and then we build upon that transaction and do subsequent transactions over the years. So it's a great rewarding opportunity. You form great relationships with your customers, and it's mutually beneficial.
Any other questions right here?
We're starting our investments in our project. It's mine now, it's my turn. It's really very exciting. And right now, also here again, we're looking for first purchases from the United States. We have a corrugated box manufacturing company. We have a wonderful company here called World United Plastic Technology, which we're very interested in. As well as we're interested in caterpillar power generation. I'm very happy to say that I want to, we're really trying to, and I really look forward to expand more some of these work in Azerbaijan in the field of agriculture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Was there another question here real quick? Right there?
Actually, what I heard here, so I heard a lot about energy and oil and gas, but what I didn't hear is the renewable energy. And basically, we know that the old energies are
Taleh, do you want to
Yeah.
tackle that one?
Alternative energy is one of the interesting and important topics which we have in the country, and particularly for the bank. We have several projects in this direction, but the main challenge what we're facing now is again we're coming back to long-term financing, and internally it's very difficult to find it. So we're really looking for international financial intermediaries who can support us, and I think Exim Bank also is very active in this direction. So this is the hot topic for Azerbaijan, taking into account that we probably have all the resources. We have a wind, we have water, so this is definitely interesting for us. But again, at this stage, the most challenging thing is the long-term financing for this.
Sometimes you have also, transmission issues with the infrastructure, so you have to evaluate that. And I'm more of a real estate investor than an energy investor, but we've looked in other economies in the region, and we found that sometimes the infrastructure may not be there yet for these types of investments to transmit efficiently. I guess the last comment or question I'll leave for Taleh is, in 2017, in the non-oil lending business, what sector, what part of the economy do you guys think you'll have your biggest origination exposure to?
When it comes to us, to PASHA Bank, we definitely look to ICT, to transportation, logistics, tourism, agriculture, definitely. And of course, our portfolio is quite diversified, so we are not very active in oil and gas. We are more on non-oil and gas sector. And I see, just want to emphasize the issue that if we're talking about strengthening the relationship between US and Azerbaijan, I think financial intermediaries will play a very important role for that, because we can talk a lot about the business. We can have a business, but we also need the financial intermediaries who will support this business. And what I see as a challenging part is building the relationship with the US banks. So currently, region and Azerbaijan itself also there is a lack of relationship in terms of the banking relationship. So I see like if we can strengthen this first relationship between the financial institutions for 2017, the industries which I just mentioned before will be very attractive and very demanding.
Could I add one thing about the renewable energy? Exim Bank has a whole group within the structured finance division that just deals with renewable energy. We have quite a bit of expertise in wind power, and GE makes a lot of wind turbines, so we understand that business very well. And we also have quite a bit of expertise in the solar area as well. Although there's not as much solar made in the United States as there once was. A lot of the solar stuff has gone to China because China just produces the solar panels very cheaply. But we still have some very high quality solar producers here in the United States that we've supported as well. So it's definitely something that's, I'll use a baseball term, it's right in Exim Bank strike zone. We have a whole group of people that understands renewable energy very well.
The reason why I'm bringing this up is because I traveled in Azerbaijan. There's a tremendous potential for bioenergy, especially in the rural areas. And there's a lot of agriculture, there's a lot of agricultural byproducts, and they do burn it right away. I mean, if we can convert that into methane gas, they can get energy as well as they get gas from that. Yep. And they're remote areas, they're not very accessible for pipelines and power lines and so forth. So they can be localized, produce energy in those places. Yep. But that's what I'm looking at. If there's some kind of financial support that we can do these in micro power generation in those remote villages, that help the
it's interesting.
economy.
Well, with that, we'll end the panel and let you guys all break for lunch. Thank you very much for your questions and your attention.
Thank you.